Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I give quite a lot of talks on retrofit and unintended consequences, but normally they're longer workshops, so I'm going to whiz through stuff. In a way, some of it will be a bit of a summary of what you've heard today already by Chris and by also Jonathan, but hopefully also some new things as well, and sort of wrapping those things up that we need to think about. So as Fionn said, I authored the Environment Design Pocketbook. I lecture at the Sheffield University School of Architecture. There's quite a lot of our sustainability students here, which is a program that I co-lead. They also have a lovely stand outside. So thank you, everyone. And as Fionn also said, I'm also involved with ECD Architects quite recently in the last 6 months as head of research. And what that really entails is, I think, in a way, what you've seen Jonathan explain, which is effectively designing with evidence and with knowledge, and trying to collect that evidence before we design, but then also once that buildings are up and running. And as Fionn also said, I did my PhD thesis on suspended timber ground floors. So my area of expertise is really Victorian terraced houses, and particularly floors. So I spend a lot of time on floors, measuring heat loss, and also under, looking at these unintended consequences, how to best insulate, what are the conditions of these floors. I'm not actually going to talk at all about floors at the moment. I wanted to talk more strategically about why should we be retrofitting existing buildings, and other issues as well, such as what are some of the unintended consequences. You've heard some of them already as well. So in the UK, we've got about 26 million existing dwellings, about 2 million other buildings, and about 450,000 heritage buildings. So I think most of the things, when we talk about retrofit, we tend to refer to these 26 million existing dwellings that are not heritage buildings and the kind of stuff that we could do to them. The issue really is that most are very badly insulated. So 50 to 65% of the energy use in dwellings goes to space heating. And as a result, because we're using mainly fossil fuels to provide the space heating, we end up with a significant impact. About 1/3 of the UK's carbon emissions, and this is about the same throughout Europe, is caused by the domestic sector, so by energy use in dwellings. And the present rate of demolition in the UK is about 0.1%. And I think that means that we're only turning over, like basically each property lasts for about, we're supposed to last for about 1,400 years. That's our rate of demolition. Now, there's obviously clear reasons why we don't demolish dwellings, hence why retrofit is also so important. And this is also why that the majority of these buildings will still be standing by 2050. So when you look at this from a carbon and an energy point of view, it's absolutely crucial that we actually upgrade these to these, as Chris was referring to, deep retrofit standards. We're looking at 80% reduction, carbon reduction targets by 2050. That's in the UK Climate Change Act. But also, this was also EU driven. So at the moment, at least, we still have our own act as well, regardless of what will happen with Brexit. But there's other reasons as well, and particularly when we're having to deal with some politicians, I name no names, who claim that climate change is a hoax. I think it's actually very important that we don't just focus on energy and on carbon, because we all live in a home, we all use buildings, and actually a lot of it, what it means to us is, one, how much does it cost to live in the house, and how comfortable are we? And so we tend to refer to these as co-benefits of also reducing carbon emissions and trying to lead to lower global and local pollution. So when we upgrade, our buildings should lead to improved thermal comfort, making people feel warmer. At the moment, we've got about 4.5 million households in fuel poverty. And that's because it costs so much to actually heat these dwellings. That's a significant number, almost 17% of households in the UK. And it really affects their health. So the idea is, again, that if we can keep these homes warmer, that actually they will live longer and healthier lives. There were about 43,000 extra winter deaths just last winter alone. Now, that's not all caused by buildings. That's just associated with, basically, winter period. And that's because people suffer from increased asthma, bronchitis, heart and lung disease, kidney disease, and mental health when homes aren't heated very well. The other thing is, as I said, ideally, retrofit leads to lower bills. I will come back to that briefly, actually, for individuals, but also the public purse. So some of the research has shown that for each pound spent on keeping homes warm, the NHS spends, saves, if you like, about 40 pence for each pound. So that's really quite a significant impact as well. Okay, so, and then of course the other issue is also one of energy security. At the moment we're still having to import energy from other countries. Brexit has happened, there is worldwide issues happening, and that also leads then to significant uncertainty with the current global climate. Also the pound has dropped, suddenly energy becomes a lot more expensive. I hope this works if I... Okay. So what I would also argue that aside from energy and carbon reasons, why we would want, carbon reduction targets, why we need to retrofit a dwelling, the housing stock in the UK, is that we also have a moral duty to actually upgrade the housing stock. So this is about people's health and well-being and their comfort in these homes as well, which I think is actually potentially a stronger argument than energy and carbon, and something we all understand a lot better. So it's not just an issue in the UK, by the way, upgrading. So the EU have worked out that they would save between 80 billion euros to 153 billion euros if they effectively can reduce the energy demand so we don't have to build new energy and power stations. Also in China, there was significant investment in 2014. I don't have later figures, but $18 billion invested in upgrade and 11 billion of that in the domestic retrofit sector. So it's not, we're not the only ones doing it, but we do have a significant challenge. Because of the sheer number of dwellings, if you go back to 25, 26 million of them, and there's only about 34 years left until 2050, as Chris was saying, we need to do this fast, not very slow over a very long period of time. We actually need to look at retrofitting, doing deep retrofits, about 800,000 buildings a year. That actually means one dwelling every minute of the day. Are we doing anywhere near that? No, we are not. And so this is, of course, a real issue. The other issue is also that not only is this target very urgent and challenging, we also cannot repeat anything if it goes wrong. Because we can't go back and do it again, even if we could afford to financially and with the disruption that it causes. But we just can't do it because of the sheer number of housing that needs to be upgraded. So what kind of upgrade is needed? If you just look here at the top, this is a typical solid wall Victorian terraced house. The approximated space heat demand is 115 to 215 kilowatt hours per meter square annum. You could see figure there was 209, one of the actual case studies. So, and that was a detached property. And it's a significant impact on obviously overall space heating, but also on carbon emissions if you multiply that by the stock. And we've got 7 million of these Victorian terraced houses in the UK alone. It's about a third of our housing stock. And what we really need to do is we need to actually upgrade this to much better standards. So we're looking at Enerfit or passive house, but really significant reduction. When we talk about deep retrofit, we tend to mean, there's not actually a proper definition for it, but people tend to mean more than 75% energy use reduction, okay, that we need to undertake. And that's usually when we talk about them as deep retrofit. Also, as Chris said, not all of it has to happen at once, so you can stage this or phase these things. There's a European project called EU Eurofit. If you Google it, you can see, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. It's an Enerfit retrofit project, and they're also collecting all that data and research, as Chris was mentioning earlier. Just very briefly on this step-by-step retrofitting, as Chris also said, always consider the whole house, okay? And it's really simple. It actually comes down to using trigger points. So for example, when somebody moves in or out of a property or extends a property, that's the right time to also do other measures. Because if you already, or for example, if the roof gets done, you already need scaffold, that's the time to also look at wall insulation externally. So those costs are shared for necessary issues with added on kind of extra energy issues. And you can basically see here, even with bathroom, a new bathroom gets installed, they're saying, look, that's actually a trigger point also to look at new control systems and, for example, insulation as well. So the overall concept, and this is again a bit of a summary of what you've heard earlier, is effectively to reduce infiltration, so increasing the airtightness, filling all the gaps and cracks, increase insulation of the whole entire fabric, including windows, and then, of course, providing good controlled background ventilation, getting rid of all that humid and polluted kind of stale air. Often that gets done mechanically. And then we also need to be careful about removing these thermal bridging spots, the cold spots, that otherwise we could get condensation. And only then should we be considering renewables. And that's pretty much how we tend to look at this. That's a general strategy, as also Chris was saying. The specifics then come really for each retrofit project. What is the appropriate insulation, how much of it? What is the appropriate heating system or ventilation system, etc. So when we do all that, we expect significant local and global benefits, so improved occupant thermal comfort, improved health should arise from that. Reduce energy use and reduce energy bills, but I'll come back to that again. Reduction in CO2 emissions if we achieve the reduced energy use, and also quieter internal environments. The main reason why most people upgrade their single glazing to double or triple is actually not because of the heat loss, it's because of security and noise from outside. So you can see that if there's other drivers that we can, and the other co-benefits that we can look at that really helps to drive some of these deep retrofit issues as well. Then of course, if we're conserving the building stock, you could also argue that we're extending the life of these buildings because we're giving them also a cosmetic upgrade and protecting them and maintaining them at that moment. So, but we must get it right the first time. As I said, it's expensive, disruptive to do all this retrofit. And urgent, because we have so many of them and such a short period of time. So we must avoid unintended consequences. What we mean by that is when we're trying to fix the energy issue or the energy bill issue or the thermal comfort issue, that we don't create other problems, as Chris also mentioned, like moisture issues, for example, or worse indoor air quality. So I'll briefly go through some of these now. I'll whiz through them. So one of the unintended consequences could be take back. So what that means is that actually we might not see the savings we expect to see post-retrofit. So we might not have the energy or bill savings. And that could be because people make up any money that they save by spending more energy elsewhere. People might decide to heat or use more rooms or to higher temperatures. The higher temperature is not always deliberate, by the way. That could be also just a consequence of the fact that it's now insulated temperatures, the rooms are warmer. And particularly when then systems are not commissioned very well, they might be still using the radiators at the same settings, for example. And a very quick note here as well, that even when you do all these things and you have lower energy use, you don't necessarily have lower bills. I live at Park Hill here in Sheffield, listed building, was retrofitted, not a deep retrofit. But what happened is that our, and I've noticed as at least one of the residents here as well, what I've noticed is that, well, basically, they've hooked us up to the Sheffield district heating system. So waste is collected in the city, burned by Veolia, and we get supplied by, I think also the university, by the waste heat. But the waste heat is sold to us at twice the rate per kilowatt hour as actual normal gas central heating. And also the standing rate is much higher. So the bills that I'm paying in Park Hill, even though that is twice, I used half the energy I did in my old Victorian Terrace house, the cost is the same for the heating. So that is a real significant issue, and I think we need to be very careful, because if we're trying to eradicate fuel poverty, we're not at that point, okay? So we also need to think about the systems, where is it hooked into, and that's where actually, if it had been a deeper retrofit, residents would have been protected from those additional costs. Another unintended consequence is a performance gap. So that related a little bit to user behavior, but in some cases the actual energy use could be a lot higher, 50% higher than actually we predicted. Especially electricity use is incredibly difficult to predict, and is caused by a combination of design, installation, workmanship, commissioning, complex user controls. If they're too complex, people won't change them, or they switch things off, or they make changes and they don't fully understand them. Also user behavior. And the other thing is, particularly for existing buildings, and this was also the case for floors in my PhD research, the predictive tools we have for old construction methods aren't very ill-suited for the older construction. So bricks were made slightly different. A brick wall was built slightly different, and we're using modern tools to calculate the U values if it was built today. And actually, that's also where divergence comes in. And then the other issue is, which is great to hear that both Jonathan Hines and also Chris Herring, that actually the projects they work on, they monitor. But we're doing way too little of that as an industry. This is almost exceptional what you guys do in many ways. and highly commendable because it helps us to understand what actually the performance was before and after and how the energy is used. So for example here, I don't know how well you can see this was Haringey's smart homes. This shows you effectively external insulation. There was no money to move these services, so they insulated quite neatly around it. But of course what that means is that could lead to fabric damage. These are cold spots, thermal bridges, where then effectively, which is another unintended consequence, you get surface or interstitial condensation, in this case surface. We could also trap driving rain. The other thing, by the way, fabric damage related, is that when we cover everything up, we might no longer see structural damage until it gets really bad because we've covered things up, which is often what we don't think about. And of course, moisture that builds up in any of these cavities can take a long time to reveal themselves, often until it's too late when there's timber rot, for example, mold growth. And then that in turn can actually transfer to internal spaces and affects indoor air quality and people's health. So, which brings me to indoor air quality, because basically, if we have fabric damage, that could be an issue, but also if we don't year-round have good control, background ventilation, getting rid of that humid air, we could also actually have these pollutants build up and issues that happen there. The other issue is also toxic finishes and insulation materials, so off-gassing that happens. So we need to be very careful about that. Sheffield is also in a radon rich area. Which means that when you do retrofit, and this is a completely specialist area, by the way, you also changes how radon gases build up or dissipate. And there's very little research on that at the moment. But this is a crucial issue as well in this area. And then, of course, the behavior of people, air fresheners, gas cooking, cleaning products, they all cause this buildup of pollution inside dwellings. So that's why we need this controlled and easy to use background ventilation all year round and specifying non-toxic materials. And by the way, even if we don't make these dwellings airtight, this year-round background ventilation is also crucial, because what happens in drafty buildings is people plug the holes, close the ventilation gaps, and you might get way too little at certain times because you're relying on natural ventilation, and too much at other times. So then it's drafty. Another risk is that we might end up with overheating, summer overheating, because a lot of the retrofits occur without solar shading. And we also have energy inefficient appliances that might give off a lot of heat. People in the building give off heat, and that heat now is retained very well because we've wrapped it in a nice warm jacket, so it stays inside very well, which is great in winter, is not so good in summer if then we add also solar gain to that. Particularly if we also internally insulate, we get rid of these stone or brick walls, and the thermal mass that would absorb some of that heat is no longer useful. And the other thing is, as well, as architects and engineers, we assume that people will open their windows at night and will have fresh air come in that takes the heat away. I never do. Security and noise. And that's what most people apparently don't do for those reasons. So we have to be more realistic in our assumptions as well. And then, of course, changing climate, also the warming kind of climate we have to face with could be a risk. So we need to consider that and minimize that at retrofit stage. And I'm almost there on the unintended consequences. As I said earlier, we create, by retrofit, quieter internal environments, but actually that could also be a bad thing. Because when you cut out all the background noise, you start focusing, you can hear the fridge, the freezer, the MVHR system. You can suddenly hear your neighbors, even though they haven't changed, and you also might hear people that you live with better. So, because you no longer have the background noise, and particularly also it could really isolate people. Before they could hear the birds sing, they no longer hear that. So those are things that at the moment, we know are things happening, we don't quite know the impacts of what they are. And then of course, finally, changing climate in itself leads to unintended consequences. So we're expecting increased storms, extreme weather, which then means that whatever intervention we did changes that appropriateness and the performance of those interventions. And one example is cavity walls. So what's happened in the last few years is that when you build a cavity wall new, you have a cavity, so any water transfers and moves out. When we fill the cavity, the whole cavity gets filled. And when we had the wettest winter in 2013-14 and the wettest spring, very wind-driven rain made these bricks wet, and all the water started to transfer to inside leaves. And we found even in places like London, where it's much less wind-driven rain, they had to go and move all of the cavity wall insulation back out. So those are the main kind of unintended consequences. Okay. I've got 1 minute, I'm told. I did practice this, but I'm obviously digressing at certain times. Yeah, yeah. So the other challenges is, I just briefly wanted to raise again this issue of lack of financial incentives. Green Deal has been abolished. We're still waiting for policy. It's been delayed since April. And we also have a VAT issue. And perhaps I'll stop at that point, because basically, if you build new, you don't pay VAT, the developer. You demolish and rebuild, you don't pay VAT. You retrofit, you get slapped with 20% VAT. So that's really a big anomaly, considering where the government says they want to be, what they wanted to happen by 2050. They were talking about zero carbon homes, and we have absolutely no policy, no drivers in place at all. If anything, you actually get encouraged to demolish and rebuild rather than retrofit. So I'm going to finish there. I had a few other challenges, but I think this might be depressing enough as it is. So thank you. Sorry I ran out of time.